Welcome to Liturgy of Whispers. I want you to do something before we begin. I want you to leave a comment below telling me exactly where you are watching this from and what time it is as you listen to my voice. Not because I am curious about geography, but because by the end of what I am about to tell you, you may find yourself wondering whether the place you are sitting right now is as safe as you believe it to be. Whether the silence around you is really silence at all. Some stories do that. They reach through the screen and rearrange something quiet inside you. This is one of those stories. There is a forest in the heart of Romania, just outside the city of Cluj-Napoca, that scientists have studied, that military personnel have investigated, that psychologists have attempted to explain, and that every single one of them has left without a complete answer. It is called Hoia Bachu, and depending on who you ask, it is either the most scientifically anomalous location on the European continent, or it is the most genuinely terrifying place that human beings have ever attempted to understand. What makes this case so deeply unsettling is not the legends alone. Legends can be dismissed. What makes this case impossible to close is the evidence. The photographs, the testimonies, the physical symptoms, the plants that grow in shapes that defy botanical explanation, the clearing at the center of the forest that has remained completely barren of life for longer than anyone can document, and the people who walk in and come back changed, or the people who walk in and do not come back at all. We are going to move through this story the way the forest itself seems to move. Slowly, deliberately, with long stretches of quiet that are suddenly broken by something you cannot explain away. We are going to begin at the beginning, which means we are going to begin with the land itself, with what the ground beneath Hoia Bachu has held across centuries, and with why the local people of Cluj-Napoca have known, long before any researcher arrived with equipment, that this particular stretch of woodland was different from every other forest in the region. Not different in the way that forests sometimes feel strange at dusk, different in a way that had a weight to it. A presence. Something that the Romanian villagers described not as supernatural, not as evil, but as aware, as if the trees themselves were paying attention. The forest covers approximately 250 hectares on the western edge of Cluj-Napoca, and it takes its name from a shepherd named Baciu, who, according to the oldest accounts that researchers have been able to trace, led a flock of 200 sheep into the forest one afternoon and was never seen again. Not the shepherd. Not a single one of the 200 sheep. No remains were ever found. No wool caught on branches. No bones buried under the roots. They simply ceased to exist within those 250 hectares, as thoroughly as if they had stepped through a door that closed behind them. The local people did not treat this as a mystery to be solved. They treated it as a boundary to be respected. For generations, the forest edge was a line that the people of the surrounding villages did not cross after dark, and in many cases did not cross at all. There was no dramatic folklore attached to it, no elaborate mythology of demons or curses. There was something quieter and more frightening than that. There was simply the understanding, passed from parent to child across hundreds of years, that Hoia Bachu was not a place that belonged to people.
That understanding held for centuries. And then, in 1968, a biologist named Alexandru Sift walked into the forest with a camera, and everything changed. Sift was not a man given to superstition. He was a scientist, trained in empirical observation, accustomed to examine the natural world through the precise and unromantic lens of biological research. He had heard the local stories about Hoia Bachu the way any educated Romanian of his generation had heard them, as cultural artifacts, as the kind of thing that rural communities construct around places they do not understand. He was not afraid of the forest. He was curious about it. Specifically, he was curious about the unusual curvature of the trees that grew along its edges, the way their trunks bent and twisted in patterns that seemed to have no relationship to wind direction or soil composition. He wanted to document them. He brought his camera for that reason. What he photographed instead changed the course of his professional life, and introduced Hoia Bachu to the international research community in a way that no amount of local testimony ever had. Because Alexandru Sift, on an ordinary afternoon in 1968, photographed a disc-shaped object moving through the sky above the forest canopy. The photograph was clear. It was analyzed. It was not, according to every expert who examined it across the following decades, the result of a camera malfunction, a trick of light, or a deliberate fabrication. It showed something in the sky above Hoia Bachu that had no conventional explanation. And it was only the first. Over the years that followed, Sift returned to the forest repeatedly, and accumulated a collection of photographs that became some of the most studied anomalous images in European paranormal research. Objects in the sky, lights moving between the trees at night, and in one photograph, taken in conditions that Sift documented meticulously, a shape at the edge of the clearing that his colleagues could not identify, and that he himself refused to describe in writing, noting only in his research journal that he had not gone back to that part of the forest again. That clearing. We will return to it. We will spend a great deal of time there before this story is finished. But for now, understand only this. It exists at the approximate center of Hoia Bachu. It is perfectly circular. It measures roughly 1 hectare in diameter, and in it, nothing grows. Not grass, not weeds, not the aggressive underbrush that covers every other inch of the forest floor. Nothing. Soil samples taken from the clearing are, by every measurable standard, identical to the soil in the surrounding forest. There is no chemical reason for the barrenness. There is no geological explanation. The clearing simply refuses life, and the people who stand inside it, researchers, journalists, curious visitors who have traveled from across the world to test their own nerve, report the same things with a consistency that is itself a form of evidence. Nausea, dizziness, the sudden and overwhelming sensation of being watched, and in several documented cases, the complete and inexplicable loss of time.
We need to talk about what it means to lose time. Not in the ordinary sense, the way an hour disappears when you are absorbed in a book, or the way a long drive can feel both endless and instantaneous when your mind is elsewhere. We are talking about something categorically different, something that researchers who study Hoia Bachu have documented in case after case with a specificity that makes casual dismissal very difficult. We are talking about people who enter the forest at a particular hour, who carry watches, who carry phones, who are accompanied by other people who are also tracking the time, and who emerge from the clearing at the center of the forest to discover that a span of time has passed for which they have no memory, no sensation, and no explanation. Not minutes. In several of the most carefully documented cases, hours, gone, cleanly and completely removed from their experience, as if someone had simply edited them out. A researcher named Adrian Patrut, a Romanian chemist who spent years investigating Hoia Bachu with instruments rather than intuition, recorded the testimony of a colleague who had accompanied him into the forest on a research expedition in the early 1990s. The colleague, a man trained in analytical chemistry with no prior interest in paranormal phenomena and no particular susceptibility to suggestion,
sat down at the edge of the central clearing to record instrument readings. Patrut continued further into the clearing to collect soil samples. When Patrut returned, his colleague was sitting in the same position, instruments in his lap, eyes open. But he did not respond immediately when Patrut spoke to him. When he did respond, he was confused about how long they had been in the forest. His instruments showed a gap in the data record of approximately 40 minutes, during which they had apparently continued to log environmental readings, but the colleague had no memory of those 40 minutes whatsoever. He was not distressed. He was not frightened. He was simply absent from those 40 minutes in a way that he could not account for and never satisfactorily explained for the remainder of his life. This kind of testimony would be easy to set aside if it existed in isolation. One man, one afternoon, one gap in memory that could be attributed to a momentary dissociative episode, to low blood sugar, to any number of mundane explanations that science keeps ready for exactly these situations. But it does not exist in isolation. The archive of similar testimonies from Hoia Bachu spans decades and crosses every demographic and professional boundary you might try to use as a filter. Skeptics and believers, scientists and tourists, soldiers and children. The consistency of the experience across such a varied population of witnesses is the thing that serious researchers keep returning to, because consistency in science is not something you ignore. Consistency is data. And the time loss is only one thread in what becomes, as you pull at it, an increasingly complex and unsettling tapestry. Because Hoia Bachu does not only take time from the people who enter it, it also leaves things behind. Physical things, marks on skin that were not there before, rashes that appear on the arms and necks of visitors within hours of leaving the forest in geometric patterns that dermatologists have examined and struggled to explain. Scratches, bruises. One of the most frequently cited cases involves a woman, a local school teacher from Cluj-Napoca, who visited the forest with a group of colleagues in the late 1970s as part of what was intended to be a casual afternoon walk. She entered the forest in good health, with no skin conditions, no allergies, no medical history that would explain what happened next. She emerged from the tree line approximately 2 hours later with 3 parallel scratches running down the length of her left forearm, deep enough to have drawn blood, which had dried by the time her colleagues noticed them. She had felt nothing. She had no memory of catching her arm on anything. The scratches were examined by a physician who found them insistent with a sharp implement rather than with a natural surface like bark or a thorned branch. He could not explain them. She could not explain them. They healed within a week and left no scars, which the physician also noted was somewhat unusual given their initial depth. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I think the temptation when you hear accounts like this is to move through them quickly, to let the accumulation of strange details wash over you as atmosphere, as the texture of a good horror story. But this was a real woman, a school teacher, a person with colleagues and a physician and a documented medical examination. The scratches were real. The blood was real. And nobody, in the decades since that afternoon, has produced an explanation for how they got there. The physical symptoms reported by visitors to Hoia Bachu have been studied most systematically by Dr. Ionut Moraru, a Romanian physician who became interested in the forest after several of his patients independently reported similar experiences following visits. Moraru began collecting and cataloging the symptoms in the 1980s, eventually accumulating records on over 200 individuals who reported physical effects they attributed to time spent in the forest. The symptoms clustered into recognizable patterns. Nausea and dizziness were nearly universal, reported by approximately 80% of his subjects. Skin eruptions appeared in roughly 40%. Headaches, particularly a specific type described as concentrated behind the left eye, appeared in just over half. And in a smaller but statistically significant subset, approximately 15% of his total sample, subjects reported what Moraru carefully described in his notes as episodes of perceptual disruption, moments in which the forest around them appeared to shift, to darken suddenly without meteorological cause, or to produce sounds that the subjects could hear clearly, but their companions standing beside them could not hear at all. That last detail, the sounds that only some people can hear, it appears again and again in the testimonies collected from Hoia Bachu across different decades and by different researchers. Voices, sometimes, not words, or at least not words in any language the listener recognized, but the unmistakable cadence and rhythm of human speech, coming from inside the tree line, from places that subsequent searches revealed to be empty. Crying in several accounts, a child crying specifically, heard by visitors in the deeper sections of the forest, always in the same general area, always stopping abruptly when the listener moved toward it. And in a handful of the most disturbing accounts, something that witnesses describe not as a sound exactly, but as a frequency, a vibration felt in the chest and the teeth rather than heard through the ears, that produced in everyone who experienced it the same immediate and overwhelming emotional response. Not fear, grief. A sudden, sourceless, crushing grief that lifted the moment the person stepped back across the tree line and into open air. What is the forest grieving? That is a question that the Romanian villagers who have lived alongside Hoia Bachu for generations would consider almost too obvious to answer. They would tell you that the forest is not grieving. They would tell you that the forest is remembering. And then they would tell you about the dead.
Every piece of land carries its dead. This is not a mystical statement. It is a historical one. The soil beneath every city, every village, every stretch of forest and field on this earth contains the remains of people who lived and suffered and ended there, and in most cases we walk above them without thinking about it, because the distance of time makes the fact of their presence abstract and comfortable. But there are places where that distance collapses, where the weight of what happened on a particular piece of ground becomes something you can feel rather than simply know intellectually. Hoia Bachu is one of those places. And when you begin to examine what the historical record tells us about the land beneath that forest, the feeling that the ground itself is trying to communicate something stops being a poetic metaphor and starts being a reasonable response to the evidence. The region of Transylvania in which Hoia Bachu sits has been inhabited continuously for thousands of years. The Dacians were here before the Romans came. The Romans built on top of what the Dacians left. The Magyars arrived and built on top of what the Romans left. The Ottomans came through and burned what the Magyars had built. And through all of it, across every conquest and occupation and forced migration that this part of Europe has endured across 2 millennia, the forest remained, not because it was protected, not because it was valued as a resource or a landmark, but because, according to every historical account that researchers have been able to trace, no one wanted to use it. No one wanted to farm it or log it or build on it. The forest was left alone because the people who lived alongside it understood, in the practical and unsentimental way that agricultural communities understand things, that Hoia Bachu did not produce what you put into it. Crops planted at its edges failed, animals grazed near it sickened, and the people who spent extended time within it came back wrong in ways that were difficult to specify, but impossible to ignore. The Dacians, who were the original inhabitants of this region and who left behind a rich tradition of sacred geography, meaning the practice of identifying specific landscapes as spiritually significant and treating them accordingly, designated certain forests as what their priests called nexus points, locations where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was understood to be thinner than elsewhere, where the two worlds pressed against each other closely enough that communication between them became possible, and where the dead who had not completed their passage from one state to the other were understood to linger, not out of malice, but out of confusion, out of the particular kind of lostness that comes from a violent or unresolved ending. The Dacian priests did not avoid these places. They built their most sacred rituals around them. They went in deliberately, prepared and protected by ceremony, to speak with what lingered there. But they were also absolutely clear that ordinary people, people without that preparation, should not enter casually, because the dead who linger in those places are not discriminating about who they reach toward. They reach toward warmth, toward life, toward anything that reminds them of what they once were. And the reaching, however unintentional, however free of malice, is not without consequence for the living. I am not asking you to believe in the cosmology of the ancient Dacians. I am asking you to notice something, which is that the description they developed, across centuries of observation and ritual practice, of what happens in places like Hoia Bachu, maps with remarkable precision onto the physical and psychological symptoms that modern researchers have documented in visitors to the forest 2,000 years later. The nausea, the dizziness, the sounds that some people hear and others do not, the grief that arrives without a source and lifts when you leave. The Dacians would have recognized every single one of those symptoms. They would have known exactly what was causing them, and they would have looked at the researchers arriving with their instruments and their soil sample kits and their electromagnetic field detectors with something between pity and aspiration, because they would have understood that you cannot measure what is happening in Hoia Bachu with any instrument designed to measure the physical world, because what is happening there is not entirely located in the physical world. But let us stay with the physical world for a moment longer, because the physical world has more to offer us here than you might expect. Because buried in the historical record of the land beneath Hoia Bachu, in the documented history of what this region endured across the centuries of conquest and occupation I described a moment ago, there is a particular chapter that historians who have studied the area
may be directly relevant to understanding why this specific forest became what it is, and that chapter involves the Ottoman campaigns through Transylvania in the 15th and 16th centuries, campaigns that were not merely military operations, but systematic programs of terror designed to break the will of the local population through the demonstration of absolute and public brutality. The Ottomans who moved through this region did not only kill their enemies, they killed populations, entire villages, men, women, children, livestock, and in several documented cases, they burned the dead rather than burying them, specifically to prevent the kind of proper burial that the local Christian population believed was necessary for the soul to pass safely into the afterlife. They understood, with the cold strategic intelligence of experienced conquerors, that denying the dead their rights was a way of terrorizing the living, because the living believed, with complete conviction, that an unburied and unblessed dead person did not rest, did not pass, remained. Historians who have cross-referenced Ottoman campaign records with the geographic location of Hoia Bachu have noted that the forest sits in a corridor that Ottoman forces moved through repeatedly during this period. There are no mass grave sites officially documented within the forest boundaries, partly because no systematic archaeological survey of Hoia Bachu has ever been completed, a fact that is itself somewhat remarkable given the level of research interest the forest has attracted. But ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted by a team from Cluj-Napoca's Baciu University in the early 2000s produced readings in several areas of the forest that the team's lead archaeologist described, carefully and with appropriate qualification, as consistent with significant subsurface disturbance across a wide area. She did not call them mass graves. She said the data was consistent with the kind of ground disturbance you would expect to find at a site where large numbers of bodies had been deposited and covered over a relatively short period of time. She recommended further investigation. The further investigation has not yet been funded or conducted. The readings remain on file. The ground in Hoia Bachu remains unexcavated, and whatever is beneath it continues, in whatever way it continues, to make itself felt by the people who walk above it. This is the context in which every other aspect of the Hoia Bachu story must be understood, not as a collection of isolated strange events occurring in a vacuum, but as the accumulated expression of a landscape that has absorbed more human suffering than most places on Earth, and that has never been given the opportunity to process it. If you believe, as the Dacians believed, as many traditions across many cultures believe, that land holds memory, that soil and root and stone retain something of what has occurred within them, then Hoia Bachu is not a mystery, it is a consequence. It is what happens when the dead are not honored, when the violence done to them is not acknowledged, when the ground is never given the ceremony it needs to release what it holds. It is a forest full of people who do not know they are dead, wandering in the dark between the trees, reaching toward the warmth of the living, confused and persistent and impossible to fully explain away with any instrument we currently possess. And in 1968, a 5-year-old girl walked into that forest alone and walked out 5 years later without having aged a single day. I need you to understand that I did not place that sentence there for effect. I placed it there because it is the most thoroughly documented and most completely inexplicable event in the recorded history of Hoia Bachu, and because it is the case that more than any photograph or instrument reading or medical symptom report broke open the international research community's relationship with this forest and forced people who had spent their careers being professionally skeptical to sit down and admit, quietly and with great discomfort, that they did not have an explanation, that the tools they had built their professional lives around were not adequate to account for what the evidence in this case clearly showed. A child went in, 5 years passed, the child came out, unchanged, and everything we thought we knew about time and matter and the fixed and reliable nature of physical reality became, in the shadow of that single case, considerably less certain than it had been before.
Her name was Andrea Constantine. She was 5 years old in the summer of 1968, the same summer that Alexandru Sift walked into Hoia Bachu with his camera and photographed something moving through the sky above the canopy. The two events occurred within weeks of each other, and researchers who have studied both cases have noted the proximity of their timing with the kind of careful neutrality that scientists use when they want to acknowledge a pattern without committing to an explanation for it. Whether the two events were connected, whether whatever Sift photographed above the forest and whatever happened to Andrea Constantine inside it were expressions of the same underlying phenomenon, is a question that nobody has been able to answer with any confidence. What is not in question is what happened. What is not in question is what the records show. And the records are more substantial than you might expect, because the Constantine case was not merely a matter of local testimony. It was investigated, documented, examined by medical professionals, by law enforcement, by researchers from 3 different Romanian universities, and eventually by journalists from publications in France and Germany who traveled to Cluj-Napoca specifically to report on it. The paper trail is long, and every document in it points to the same conclusion, which is that Andrea Constantine was gone for 5 years and came back exactly as she had left. She disappeared on a Tuesday afternoon in late July. Her mother, a woman named Florica Constantine, who worked as a seamstress in Cluj-Napoca, told investigators that Andrea had been playing in the yard behind their house, which backed onto a field that bordered the western edge of Hoia Bachu Forest. Florica had gone inside briefly to answer a neighbor who had come to the door. When she returned to the yard, Andrea was gone. The gate that led from the yard into the field beyond was open. It had been latched. Andrea was 5 years old and had been able to open latched gates since she was 3, which her mother noted with the particular mixture of pride and exhaustion that parents of capable small children will recognize. The field beyond the gate showed no signs of disturbance. The grass was tall and unbroken, except for a narrow track of bent stems leading toward the tree line of Hoia Bachu, which Florica Constantine followed at a run, calling her daughter's name, until the track disappeared at the edge of the forest, and the grass on either side of it was undisturbed, and the forest beyond it was silent. The search that followed was extensive by the standards of the era and the region. Police from Cluj-Napoca conducted a ground search of the forest perimeter. Volunteers from the surrounding villages, many of whom were deeply reluctant to enter the forest at all, formed search lines and moved through the outer sections of the tree line calling the child's name. Dogs were used. The dogs, according to the officer who recorded the search in his official report, behaved unusually when they reached a certain depth within the forest. They stopped. They refused to continue. They were described in the report as showing signs of extreme distress without any identifiable cause, whining and pressing against their handlers, and attempting to return to the forest edge. The search was called off after 3 days. Andrea Constantine was officially recorded as missing, presumed dead, in the autumn of 1968. Her mother did not accept this. She continued to go to the edge of the forest every day for 5 years, standing at the tree line, calling her daughter's name. The neighbors found this unbearable to witness. Several of them, in interviews conducted years later, said that Florica's daily vigil at the forest edge was the most haunting thing they had ever seen. A woman calling into a silence that never answered, until the day it did. On a morning in the summer of 1973, 5 years after Andrea Constantine disappeared, Florica Constantine arrived at the forest edge at her usual time, called her daughter's name at her usual volume, and Andrea walked out of the trees. She was wearing the same dress she had been wearing the day she disappeared. The dress was clean, not merely intact but clean, unworn, as if it had been laundered and pressed within the last few hours. Andrea herself showed no signs of having spent 5 years in a forest. No malnutrition, no exposure damage, no injuries, no parasites, no evidence of any kind that her body had experienced the passage of 5 years of time. She was, by every physical measure that the physicians who examined her within hours of her reappearance could identify, exactly as she had been the day she vanished. The same height, the same weight, the same dental development, the same everything. A 5-year-old child who had been missing for 5 years, and who was still, by every available measure, 5 years old. The physicians who examined her were not a credulous group. They were medical professionals in a communist-era Romanian healthcare system that was institutionally hostile to anything that could not be explained in materialistic terms, because unexplained phenomenon were ideologically inconvenient in a state that had officially abolished the supernatural, along with private property and religious practice. These were doctors with careers to protect and professional reputations built on the application of rational methodology to observable fact. And their reports, which have been preserved and which researchers gained access to following the fall of Romanian communism in 1989, are extraordinary documents not for what they claim, but for what they cannot bring themselves to claim. They record the physical findings with scrupulous precision. They note the absence of any sign of aging. They note the condition of the dress. They note that the child appeared well-nourished and well-rested. And then, in language that becomes increasingly careful and increasingly strained as the reports progress, they attempt to construct explanations. Hidden care. An unknown benefactor who had sheltered the child for 5 years without anyone knowing. A mistake in the original identification. Perhaps this was not actually Andrea Constantine but a child who resembled her. These explanations are proposed and then quietly abandoned because the evidence does not support them. Florica Constantine identified her daughter immediately and with absolute certainty. Neighbors who had known Andrea since birth confirmed the identification, and the physical evidence, the unchanging body, the untouched dress, the dental records that matched with no development since the last examination 5 years prior,
ruled out every alternative the physicians tried to construct. What Andrea herself said about where she had been was not helpful in the way investigators hoped it would be helpful, but it was consistent in a way that researchers have since found deeply significant. She said she had been in the forest. She said it had not been dark there, that there had been light even at night. She said there had been other people there, but when pressed to describe them she became distressed and could not continue. She said she had not been hungry or cold or frightened. She said time had felt different there, that it had felt slow, or perhaps that it had not felt like time at all, more like a single long moment that she had been inside. And she said, in a statement that her mother recorded and that appears in several of the subsequent research reports, that the forest had not wanted to let her leave, that she had been trying to leave for what felt like a very long time, and that something had finally changed that made it possible. She did not know what that something was. She never knew. Andrea Constantine grew up eventually, as children do even when they have been touched by something that defies explanation, and she spent the rest of her life declining to speak publicly about what happened to her. She gave one interview in the late 1980s to a Romanian journalist, and then refused all subsequent requests. In that interview she said only one thing that she had not said before. She said that she still dreamed about the forest regularly, that in the dream she was always 5 years old, and that in the dreams she was always still inside it. The Constantine case broke something open in the research community that had been building since Sift's photographs 3 decades earlier. Because Sift's photographs could be argued about. Photographs can be faked, can be misinterpreted, can be the product of camera anomalies or deliberate deception. But Andrea Constantine was not a photograph. She was a person with a birth record and a medical history and a mother and neighbors who had known her all her life. A person who had been missing for 5 years and who came back without a mark on her. And the question that her case forced into the center of every serious conversation about Hoia Bachu was the question that nobody, in all the decades of research that followed, has been able to fully answer. Not where she was. That question is unanswerable with the tools we have. But a different question. A question about the nature of the place itself. About what Hoia Bachu actually is. Not what legends say it is. Not what local tradition says it is. But what the accumulated weight of documented evidence, examined honestly and without the comfort of easy dismissal, suggests it might be. A place with time does not behave the way it behaves everywhere else. A place where the ordinary rules of physical reality become negotiable in ways that we do not understand and cannot control. A place that takes things in and holds them and releases them, according to a logic that is entirely its own. And a place, as the researchers who came after Sift and after the Constantine case would discover, that was becoming increasingly active.
The 1970s were a strange decade for Romania in ways that extended far beyond the particular strangeness of Hoia Bachu. Nicolae Ceausescu's government had tightened its grip on every aspect of Romanian intellectual and cultural life, and the official position of the state on anything that could not be explained through the lens of scientific materialism was simple and unambiguous. It did not exist. Paranormal phenomena, religious experience, folk traditions that attributed agency or awareness to the natural world, all of it was classified as superstition, as the residue of pre-revolutionary peasant consciousness that the new Romania was in the process of leaving behind. Researchers who wanted to study Hoia Bachu in any serious capacity did so carefully, framing their work in language that the state could tolerate, describing their investigations as studies of electromagnetic anomalies or unusual botanical phenomena, rather than as investigations into the paranormal. They published in small journals with limited circulation. They shared findings in private correspondence rather than in public forums. They built a body of knowledge about the forest that was, by the end of the decade, substantial and detailed, and almost entirely invisible to the wider world. The most significant figure in that hidden decade of research was a military engineer named Emil Barnea. Barnea was not, by training or temperament, a person drawn to mystery. He was a practical man, a man who built things and measured things and trusted the evidence of instruments over the evidence of intuition. He had heard about Hoia Bachu the way most educated Romanians of his generation had heard about it, as background noise, as the kind of persistent local legend that accumulates around any sufficiently isolated piece of landscape. He did not think about it seriously until the summer of 1968, which was, as you now know, a summer of unusual activity in and around the forest. Barnea was on a camping trip with his girlfriend and 2 friends in the hills outside Cluj-Napoca when his girlfriend pointed at something in the sky above the tree line of Hoia Bachu and asked him what it was. Barnea looked up.
And then, with the presence of mind that distinguished him from most people who encounter something they cannot explain, he reached for his camera. The photograph he took that afternoon became one of the most analyzed and most debated images in the history of European UFO research. It showed with a clarity that photographers and imaging analysts who examined it across the following decades consistently described as remarkable, a disc-shaped object hovering above the canopy of Hoia Bachu Forest. The object was metallic in appearance. It was not a bird, it was not a weather balloon, a misidentified aircraft, a lens flare, or any of the other standard explanations that investigators reach for when confronted with images of this kind. It was, according to every technical analysis conducted on the original negative, a solid physical object of unknown type, approximately the size of a large vehicle, hovering at an altitude of perhaps 200 meters above the forest canopy in clear afternoon light. Barnea took the photograph and then watched as the object accelerated and disappeared in a direction and at a speed that no conventional aircraft of the era could have matched. He did not report what he had seen immediately. He developed the photographs, examined them, sat with what he had documented for several weeks, and then made the decision that changed the trajectory of his life. He submitted the images to a colleague at the Institute of Atomic Physics in Bucharest, a physicist named Florin Gheorghita, who had been quietly collecting reports of anomalous aerial phenomena in Romania for years, and who received Barnea's photographs with the kind of controlled excitement that scientists display when they encounter evidence that is better than anything they have previously seen. Gheorghita analyzed the images exhaustively. He subjected them to every technical examination available to him, and his conclusion, published in a carefully worded paper that used language designed to scientists while communicating its findings clearly to anyone who read it with attention, was that the object in Barnea's photographs was real, was physical, was not explicable by any known technology, and had been photographed directly above the forest that had been producing anomalous reports for as long as anyone in the region could remember. The connection between the aerial phenomena and the experiences of people on the ground within the forest was something that both Barnea and Gheorghita were careful not to state explicitly in any published work, because stating it explicitly would have required them to propose a mechanism connecting the two, and any proposed mechanism would have taken them into territory that the Romanian state found ideologically unacceptable. But in private correspondence, in letters that researchers gained access to after 1989, both men were considerably less restrained. Gheorghita wrote to Barnea in 1971 that he had become convinced, on the basis of the accumulated evidence, that Hoia Baciu was not merely a location where anomalous phenomena occurred, but was in some sense a source of them, that the forest itself was generating something, producing some kind of energy or field or condition that both drew the aerial phenomena and caused the experiences reported by people on the ground. He did not know what that something was. He was honest about that. But he was no longer willing, even in private, to pretend that the phenomena were unconnected, or that their concentration above and within this specific forest was coincidental. Other researchers were reaching similar conclusions through different routes during the same period. A botanist named Gheorghe Furdu spent 3 years in the 1970s conducting a systematic study of the trees in Hoia Baciu and produced findings that are, in their quiet way, as disturbing as any testimony about lights in the sky or lost time or children who do not age. Furdu documented the growth patterns of the trees in the forest with meticulous precision, measuring trunk curvature, root spread, branch orientation, and growth rate across hundreds of individual specimens. What he found was that the trees of Hoia Baciu did not grow the way trees grow anywhere else, not in any forest he had studied, not according to any botanical model he had been trained to apply. The trunks of the trees in the deeper sections of the forest grew in spirals, not gentle curves produced by wind exposure or competition for light, but tight, deliberate-looking spirals that in some cases completed full rotations around the tree's own vertical axis. The branches grew at angles that had no relationship to light source or prevailing wind. The root systems, where Furdu was able to examine them, spread in patterns that seemed almost geometric, radiating outward from central points in configurations that, when mapped from above, looked disturbingly intentional. Furdu was careful in his published work. He described what he found without speculating about causes. But the causes were what every researcher who read his findings immediately began to think about, because the growth patterns he documented were consistent with exposure to a strong and irregular electromagnetic field, a field that fluctuated in intensity and possibly in direction over time, that was present throughout the deeper sections of the forest, but strongest in and around the central clearing, and that had been influencing the growth of the trees for long enough that the distortions had become structural rather than superficial. The trees were not merely bent. They had grown bent, over decades and possibly centuries, shaped from their earliest stages by something that was there before they were and that had continued to be there throughout their entire lives. The electromagnetic anomalies in Hoia Bachu had been noted before Ferdou's botanical work. Visitors to the forest had been reporting compass malfunctions since at least the 1950s, compasses spinning freely or pointing in directions that had no relationship to magnetic north. And the phenomenon was consistent enough that it had become one of the standard expectations of anyone entering the forest with navigation equipment. But Ferdou's findings added something new to the electromagnetic picture, because they suggested that whatever was producing the field anomalies was not a temporary or intermittent phenomenon. It was permanent. It had been there long enough to reshape living things over generations. It was, in the most literal sense possible, part of the landscape. And when researchers began to map the areas of strongest electromagnetic disturbance against the areas of the forest where the most intense human experiences were concentrated, the correlation was precise. The central clearing, where nothing grew, where compasses failed most dramatically, where the ground-penetrating radar had found its most significant subsurface disturbances, was also the place where the time loss cases were clustered, where the physical symptoms were most intense, where the sounds were most frequently heard, and where, in the summer of 1968, a 5-year-old girl had walked in and not come out for 5 years. Whatever was in the center of Hoia Bachu, whatever had been there long enough to bend trees and burn grass and pull children out of time, the researchers of the 1970s were beginning to understand that it was not random, not scattered across the forest equally, but concentrated, focused, as if something at the heart of that clearing was the source, and everything else, the lights, the sounds, the lost time, the scratches on skin, the grief that arrived without warning, was simply the radiation of that source moving outward through the trees and into the people who wandered close enough to feel it. The question was what the source was, and the answer, when it finally began to take shape in the work of the researchers who came after, was not the answer anyone had been expecting.
There is a concept in theoretical physics called a quantum vacuum fluctuation. It is not a fringe idea. It is not the kind of thing that exists only in the speculative margins of scientific literature. It is a documented, mathematically described, experimentally verified phenomenon that sits at the heart of our current understanding of the nature of space itself. The basic idea is this: empty space is not actually empty. At the subatomic level, the vacuum of space is constantly producing pairs of particles that flicker into existence and then annihilate each other almost instantaneously, borrowing energy from the fabric of space-time itself for the briefest possible moment before returning it. The universe, at its most fundamental level, is not a stable and static thing. It is a constant, churning sea of emergence and collapse, of things appearing and disappearing so rapidly that at the scale of ordinary human experience, we perceive it as stillness, as emptiness, as the reliable, predictable, fixed physical world that we have built our entire civilization on the assumption of. I am telling you this because the researchers who began to approach Hoia Bachu from a theoretical physics perspective in the late 1970s and 1980s, a small group working largely in isolation from each other and arriving at similar conclusions through independent routes, proposed that the central clearing of the forest was a location where the quantum vacuum was behaving differently than it behaved everywhere else, where the fluctuations that normally canceled each other out almost instantaneously were instead, for reasons that the researchers could not fully explain but could describe mathematically, stabilizing, persisting, building on each other rather than annihilating each other, creating, in the immediate vicinity of the clearing, a local condition in which the boundary between the virtual and the actual, between the things that flicker briefly into existence and the things that remain, was thinner and more permeable than anywhere else on the surface of the earth that these researchers had studied or heard of. This is an extraordinary claim. I want to be clear about that. I am not presenting it as established scientific consensus because it is not. It is a hypothesis, developed by a small number of researchers working at the edge of what mainstream physics is willing to entertain, applied to a location that mainstream science has largely preferred to ignore. But I am also not dismissing it, because the people who developed it were not cranks or fantasists. They were trained physicists and mathematicians who looked at the documented evidence from Hoia Bachu and asked what kind of physical mechanism could account for all of it simultaneously. Not just the electromagnetic anomalies in isolation, not just the time loss cases in isolation, not just the botanical distortions in isolation, all of it together, as a coherent body of evidence pointing toward a single underlying cause. And the mechanism they arrived at, the unstable quantum vacuum, the place where virtual particles persist and the fabric of space-time becomes locally unreliable, accounted for all of it in a way that no other single mechanism could. Think about what an unstable quantum vacuum would do to time. Time, in our current physical understanding, is not a fixed and universal constant. Einstein demonstrated this more than a century ago.
Time is relative. It moves at different rates depending on the strength of the gravitational field you are in and the speed at which you are moving. But the quantum vacuum hypothesis applied to Hoia Baciu suggests something beyond relativistic time dilation. It suggests that in a location where the vacuum fluctuations are not canceling but accumulating, time itself might become locally discontinuous, might develop gaps, might, in extreme cases, simply stop for a localized volume of space while continuing everywhere else. A person standing in the center of the clearing, inside that locally discontinuous time, would experience nothing. They would not feel time passing because in the immediate volume of space they occupied, it was not passing. They would exist in a prolonged present, a single moment stretched without sensation, until the local condition shifted and time resumed, and they found themselves returned to a world that had moved on without them. Andrea Constantine, standing in the central clearing of Hoia Bachu Forest, inside a bubble of discontinuous time, not aging, not hungry, not frightened, experiencing what she later described as a single long moment, waiting without knowing she was waiting for the local condition to shift enough to release her. 5 years passing outside the clearing, while inside it nothing passed at all. This is not a comfortable explanation. It does not have the clean resolution of a conventional mystery solved by conventional means, but it is an explanation that is consistent with both the physical evidence and with Andrea's own account of her experience in a way that no other explanation has managed to be. And it is consistent with something else, with the reports accumulated across decades by researchers from Barnia to Mararu to the theoretical physicists who came later, of objects appearing above the clearing, lights, disks, forms that moved without following the rules of aerodynamics as we understand them. Because an unstable quantum vacuum does not only affect time, it affects matter, it affects energy. It creates, in the space above and around it, conditions in which things that do not normally manifest in the physical world can briefly do so. The virtual particles that everywhere else flicker in and out of existence too quickly to interact with anything can, in the vicinity of a persistent vacuum fluctuation, stabilize long enough to become visible, long enough to be photographed, long enough to leave marks on film and on skin and on the growth patterns of trees. The lights above Hoia Bachu, in this framework, are not vehicles. They are not intelligences arriving from somewhere else. They are the vacuum itself, made briefly visible. The forest is not being visited. It is generating. It is producing, from its own disturbed and churning ground, manifestations of the energy that has been accumulating there since before any human being was alive to see it. But this framework, as elegant as it is in accounting for the physical phenomena, runs into a problem when it tries to account for the other category of experience, the emotional experiences, the grief, the sounds of crying and of speech, the sensation of being watched, the dreams that Andrea Constantine still had decades later, dreams in which she was always inside the forest, always 5 years old, always waiting. Because quantum vacuum fluctuations do not grieve, unstable space-time does not cry, a localized anomaly in the fabric of physical reality does not reach toward the living with the specific, personal, desperate quality that witnesses to Hoia Bachu consistently describe. The physical explanation accounts for the physics, but it does not account for the feeling. And in this case, the feeling is not a minor or peripheral detail that can be set aside once the physics is explained. The feeling is central. It is the thing that every visitor to the forest, from the most credulous tourist to the most rigorous scientist, takes away with them. The conviction, immediate and overwhelming and impossible to fully articulate, that they are not alone in the forest, that something in there is aware of them, that whatever is in the center of the clearing knows they are there, and is, in whatever way is available to it, reaching toward them. A Romanian psychologist named Dr. Hoia Bachu spent 4 years in the late 1990s conducting structured interviews with people who had visited Hoia Bachu and reported significant emotional experiences there. Her sample was large by the standards of this kind of research, over 300 subjects, and her methodology was careful. She was not trying to prove anything, she was trying to characterize, to find the common threads in a large body of subjective experience, and to describe them with enough precision that they could be studied rather than merely collected. And what she found, when she analyzed her data, was that the emotional experiences reported by visitors to Hoia Bachu cluster into 2 distinct categories that she labeled in her published work, contact experiences and residue experiences. Contact experiences were those in which the subject felt the presence of something that seemed to be aware of them specifically, that seemed to be responding to them as individuals rather than merely registering their presence as a physical object in a space. These experiences were characterized by the specific quality of the emotional transmission, the grief, the desperation, the sense of something trying to communicate across a barrier it could not fully breach. Residue experiences were different. They were characterized not by the sense of a present awareness, but by something more like an echo, a recording, an emotional imprint so strong that it had become part of the environment itself, playing back not because anything was there to play it, but because the ground had absorbed it so completely that it was indistinguishable from the ground. Baciu's interpretation of her findings was careful and qualified in the way that good psychological research always is, but her conclusion was clear. Hoia Bachu was, by the evidence of her data, both things simultaneously. It was a place where something aware was present and reaching,
and it was a place where the emotional residue of enormous historical suffering had become embedded in the landscape so deeply that it was now part of the physical environment, in a way that visitors experienced directly, not as memory or imagination, but as sensation, as feeling, as the forest itself pressing its history into the bodies of the people who walked through it. Two kinds of haunting, operating simultaneously, in the same 250 hectares of twisted trees and barren clearing and disturbed ground, and between them accounting for every category of documented experience that researchers had spent 30 years trying to explain. The physics and the grief, together. The unstable vacuum and the unburied dead, together. A forest that was broken in two different ways that turned out, when you examined them closely enough, to be the same breaking.
By the time the 1980s arrived, Hoia Bachu had accumulated enough documented evidence, enough serious research, enough cross-referenced testimony from enough different categories of witness, that the question facing the small international community of researchers who had been tracking it was no longer whether something genuinely anomalous was occurring there. That question had been settled, at least within that community, by the weight of evidence accumulated across 2 decades of investigation. The question that replaced it was harder, and in some ways more troubling. Not what is happening in Hoia Bachu, but why is it getting worse? Because it was getting worse. The frequency of reported incidents had been increasing steadily since the late 1960s, and the intensity of those incidents had been escalating in a way that the researchers who were paying attention found deeply unsettling. The early reports from the 1950s and before, the ones preserved in local records and in the oral histories collected by ethnographers working in the Cluj-Napoca region, described Hoia Bachu as a place of ambient strangeness, a place where animals behaved oddly, and compasses failed, and people felt uneasy. Significant, certainly. Worthy of avoidance, absolutely. But not dramatic. Not the kind of place that produced the scale of experiences that were being documented by the 1970s and 1980s. The time loss cases, the physical symptoms, the encounters with aerial phenomena, the intensity of the emotional experiences, all of it had been building steadily, as if whatever was operating within the forest was growing stronger, as if the source at the center of the clearing was not static, but dynamic, not a fixed anomaly sitting quietly in the landscape, but something that was, in whatever sense could be applied to a non-biological phenomenon, developing. The researcher who articulated this observation most clearly was a physicist named Dr. Valentin Timofte, who had been studying the electromagnetic data from Hoia Bachu since the mid-1970s, and who published, in 1983, a paper that circulated in the small world of serious anomalous phenomena research and was largely ignored outside it. The paper was titled, in its English translation, On the Progressive Intensification of Geophysical Anomalies at the Hoia Bachu Site, and its central argument was precisely what its title suggested. Timofte had assembled every available set of electromagnetic measurements taken at the site over the preceding 2 decades, standardized them for the different instruments and methodologies used by different researchers, and graphed the results over time. The graph showed a clear and consistent upward trend. The field anomalies were stronger in 1983 than they had been in 1968. They had been stronger in 1975 than in 1968. The intensification was not dramatic from year to year, but accumulated over 15 years, it was unambiguous. Something in Hoia Bachu was growing. Timofte was careful not to speculate in his published paper about what was causing the intensification. He presented the data and left the interpretation to his readers. But in the research notes that his family made available to scholars after his death in 2004, he was considerably less restrained. He wrote that he believed the intensification was a feedback process, that the vacuum anomaly at the center of the clearing was not merely persisting but was being fed, that the energy of human attention, of human fear and grief and wonder, of the emotional intensity that visitors brought to the forest and left behind them when they went, was somehow contributing to the strength of the phenomenon, that Hoia Bachu was in a sense he found profoundly disturbing to contemplate, eating, drawing sustenance from the emotional energy of the people it affected, growing stronger with every terrified visitor, every grieving researcher, every journalist who arrived with the intention of debunking and left shaken and uncertain. The attention itself was fuel. The forest was feeding on being known. This idea that the phenomenon was not passive but active, not merely present but acquisitive, reshaped the way the researchers who encountered it thought about what they were doing. Because if Timofte was right, then studying Hoia Bachu was not a neutral act. Every expedition into the forest, every instrument reading, every interview with a witness, every published paper that brought new attention to the site was contributing to the growth of what they were studying. They were not observers standing outside the phenomenon and documenting it from a safe distance. They were participants, they were feeding it, and the more they fed it, the stronger it became,
and the stronger it became, the more dramatic the phenomena, and the more dramatic the phenomena, the more researchers were drawn to investigate, and the more researchers investigated, the more they fed it. A loop, a self-reinforcing cycle with no obvious exit point, and an end state that nobody wanted to think about too carefully. Not everyone accepted Timofey's feeding hypothesis. It was, even within the already unconventional world of Hoia Bachu research, a significant conceptual leap, and several of his colleagues pushed back on it hard. The physicist Adrian Constantine, no relation to Andrea, argued that the intensification Timofey had documented could be explained by natural geological processes, by slow shifts in the underground structure of the site that were gradually concentrating whatever geophysical anomaly was producing the electromagnetic effects. He did not dispute the reality of the intensification, he disputed the explanation for it. The debate between the geological explanation and the feeding hypothesis occupied the small research community throughout the 1980s and was never fully resolved, partly because the evidence available to them was not sufficient to definitively distinguish between the two mechanisms, and partly because the collapse of Romanian communism in 1989 disrupted the research community in ways that took years to recover from, scattering some researchers, opening archives that others immediately dove into, and bringing for the first time a wave of international attention to a site that had been studied almost entirely in isolation for 2 decades. The opening of Romania after 1989 did 2 things to Hoia Bachu simultaneously. It brought in serious international researchers with better equipment and more institutional support than the Romanian scientists had been able to access under the communist system, and it brought in tourists. Not a trickle of curious visitors, but an accelerating flood of people who had read about the forest on the early internet, who had seen the photographs, who had heard about the Constantine case and the aerial phenomena and the botanical distortions, and who arrived at the tree line with cameras and voice recorders, and in many cases a kind of eager anticipation of encounter that the Romanian researchers who had spent years studying the site found deeply worrying. Because if Timofey's feeding hypothesis had any validity at all, then a sudden massive increase in the emotional intensity of human attention directed at the site was not a neutral development. It was an acceleration. It was stepping hard on a pedal that the researchers were not at all certain should be stepped on. The incidents of the 1990s, documented now by a much larger and more internationally diverse pool of witnesses and researchers, showed a pattern consistent with Timofey's prediction. They were more frequent, they were more intense. The time loss cases, which had previously been reported by perhaps 1 in 20 visitors who entered the central clearing, were now being reported by closer to 1 in 5. The physical symptoms were more severe. The scratches and rashes that had previously appeared as minor marks were in several documented cases from the mid-1990s, significant enough to require medical attention. And the aerial phenomena, which Sift and Barnet had photographed in the late 1960s as occasional and remarkable events, had become in the decade after Romania's opening almost commonplace, reported and photographed and filmed by dozens of different visitors on dozens of different occasions. The images analyzed by researchers who reached the same conclusions that had been reached about Sift's original photographs a quarter-century earlier: real, physical, unidentified, present above the clearing with a regularity that suggested not visitation but residence. And then, in 1995, a team of researchers from the University of Cluj-Napoca entered the forest with the most sophisticated instrument package that had ever been brought to the site, intending to conduct the most thorough and systematic investigation of the central clearing that had ever been attempted. They set up their equipment around the perimeter of the clearing at carefully measured intervals. They calibrated everything. They established baseline readings, and then one by one they stepped into the clearing to take readings from its interior. The first 3 researchers entered without incident, reporting the standard suite of symptoms: nausea, dizziness, the feeling of being watched, and completing their instrument readings before stepping back out. The 4th researcher, a doctoral student named Marius Inache, who was 26 years old, and who had no prior history of psychological instability or medical conditions of any kind, stepped into the clearing, took 3 steps towards its center, and stopped. His colleagues watched him stand motionless for approximately 40 seconds, and then he turned around and walked back out of the clearing and sat down on the ground, and was unable to speak coherently for nearly 20 minutes. When he was able to speak, what he said was recorded by 3 different people and preserved in the research notes from that expedition. He said that when he had reached the center of the clearing, he had seen something, not with his eyes. He was careful about this distinction, emphatic about it in a way that his colleagues found striking. Not with his eyes, with something else, something he did not have a word for. He had seen, in whatever sense that word applied to a perception that was not visual, every person who had ever died in or near the forest simultaneously, not sequentially, not one after another, all of them at once, hundreds of people, possibly thousands, all present in the space of the clearing at the same moment, layered over each other like transparencies, each one distinct and individual and aware, each one turning towards him as he entered, each one reaching. He said the grief in the clearing was not a feeling, it was a substance. It had weight and texture and temperature. It pressed against him from every direction. And in the center of it, at the very heart of the clearing, there was something that was not one of the dead, something older than the dead, something that had been there before the first human being ever set foot in the forest, and would be there after the last one was gone. He could not describe it. He tried several times and stopped each time, not because he lacked words, but because the words he had were not adequate to the thing he was describing. He said only that it had looked at him, and that being looked at by it was the most terrifying and the most sacred experience of his entire life, and that he would never go back into that clearing, and that he would never stop thinking about what he had seen.
Marius Inake never published his account formally. He completed his doctorate, went on to a respectable academic career in geophysics, and spent the remainder of his professional life studying things that stayed where you put them and behaved according to the laws that govern them. He gave one private account of what happened to him in the clearing to a colleague, who included it, with Inake's permission, in a research compendium on anomalous human experiences at geophysically active sites. He did not attend conferences on Hoia Bachu. He did not respond to journalists. He did not contribute to the growing online literature about the forest that exploded in the early years of the internet and that brought the site to the attention of a global audience for the first time. He lived with what he had seen in the clearing the way you live with something that cannot be shared without being diminished, that cannot be explained without being distorted, that exists most completely and most honestly in the silence you keep around it. His colleagues from the 1995 expedition reported that he was, in the weeks following that afternoon, visibly changed. Not disturbed in a clinical sense, not traumatized in any way that manifested as dysfunction, but quieter, more careful, as if he had been given information about the nature of reality that he was still in the process of integrating, and that would, he understood, take the rest of his life to fully absorb. The 1995 expedition produced more than Inake's experience, though his experience was what the researchers who had been there remembered most vividly when they spoke about it in later years. The instrument readings from that day were the most detailed and comprehensive ever recorded at the site, and they confirmed and extended everything that the preceding decades of research had suggested. The electromagnetic field anomalies in the central clearing were not merely strong, they were structured. They had a pattern. The field did not simply radiate outward uniformly from a central point, but pulsed, rhythmically, at a frequency that the team's instruments recorded with precision, and that one of the physicists on the team noted in the expedition's research notes was disturbingly close to the frequency of certain brainwave states in human beings. Specifically, the frequency associated with the hypnagogic state, the transitional state between waking and sleep, in which the boundary between conscious perception and unconscious imagery becomes permeable, and in which people frequently report vivid and emotionally intense experiences that feel more real than ordinary waking life. The clearing was, if the frequency correspondence was not coincidental, broadcasting at the precise frequency most likely to induce altered states of consciousness in any human nervous system that entered it. Whether this was a natural consequence of whatever geophysical process was producing the field, or whether it was, in some sense, that the researchers were deeply reluctant to commit to in writing, intentional, was a question that the expedition's final report declined to address directly, but it was a question that everyone who read the data asked immediately, and that nobody who asked it ever entirely let go of. The frequency finding recontextualized something that had been in the research record since the earliest investigations, but had never been adequately explained. The fact that not everyone who entered the clearing had intense experiences, that the phenomena seemed selective, that some visitors walked through the central clearing and felt nothing beyond mild discomfort, while others standing next to them were overwhelmed by experiences so intense they needed assistance leaving the forest. The standard explanation for this variability had always been psychological, that some people were more suggestible, more imaginatively engaged, more emotionally open to the kind of experience the forest offered. And while that explanation was not without merit, it had always felt insufficient to the researchers who knew the cases in detail, because the people who had the most intense experiences in Hoia Bachu were not, as a group, particularly suggestible or emotionally volatile. They included hard-nosed military engineers like Barnea, and rigorous analytical chemists like Batrut's colleague, and doctoral students in geophysics like Inake. These were not people who frightened easily or imagined readily. They were people who prided themselves on the stability and reliability of their perceptions, and yet they were the ones who saw things and heard things and lost time and came back changed. The frequency data suggested a different explanation. If the clearing was broadcasting at a frequency that interacted specifically with the hypnagogic state, then the variability in response might not be primarily about psychology at all. It might be about neurology, about the specific configuration of individual nervous systems and their natural resonance frequencies.
Some people's brains at baseline oscillated frequencies closer to the hypnagogic range than others. These people are not necessarily more imaginative or more suggestible. They are simply, at the level of their basic neurological architecture, more tuned to the frequency the clearing was broadcasting, more susceptible not in a psychological sense but in a physical one, like a tuning fork that resonates when its specific frequency is played, regardless of whether the fork wants to resonate or believes in resonance or thinks resonance is a real phenomenon. The forest was not selecting for believers, it was selecting for receivers, and the people it reached most deeply were the ones whose nervous systems happened to be built in the way that made them most transparent to what it was broadcasting. This reframing had implications that extended beyond the question of who experienced what in Hoia Bachu. It had implications for the nature of the experiences themselves, because if the clearing was interacting with the hypnagogic state, then the content of what people experienced there, the visions, the voices, the sense of presence, the overwhelming grief, was not simply being generated by the forest and transmitted to the visitor, it was being generated collaboratively. The forest was providing the carrier frequency, the state of altered consciousness that made certain kinds of perception possible, but the content, what filled that state, what took shape in the opened perception of the person standing in the clearing, was coming from somewhere else, from the ground beneath them, from the accumulated emotional residue of everything that had happened there across centuries, from whatever had been pressing against the boundary between the living and the dead for as long as the forest had been what it was. The clearing was not showing people what it contained, it was opening people wide enough that what the ground contained could finally be seen, making the visitor temporarily permeable to a layer of reality that was always there, that the ordinary armoring of waking consciousness kept at a distance, that only in the hypnagogic state became accessible. What Marius Anake saw in the clearing in 1995 was in this framework not a hallucination, it was a perception. A genuine perception of something genuinely present, accessed through a state of consciousness that the clearing itself had induced in him, a state in which the normal filters between his awareness and the deeper reality of the place had been temporarily dissolved. He saw the dead because the dead were there. He felt the grief because the grief was real, embedded in the soil and the roots and the electromagnetic field itself. The residue of centuries of suffering pressed into the landscape so deeply that it had become indistinguishable from the landscape. And at the center of it, the thing that was not one of the dead, the thing older than the dead that had looked at him, that was not a hallucination either. It was whatever had been in that clearing before the first human being died there, whatever had drawn the Dacian priests to build their rituals around places like this, whatever the local people of Cluj-Napoca had been keeping their respectful distance from for as long as anyone could remember, whatever the shepherd Baciu had walked his flock of 200 sheep toward on an ordinary afternoon centuries ago and never walked away from. The international attention that came to Hoia Bachu in the years following Romania's opening brought with it, along with the researchers and the tourists, a category of visitor that the Romanian scientists who had spent decades studying the site found particularly troubling: the practitioners, the people who arrived not to investigate but to engage, who came to the clearing not to measure it but to commune with it, mediums, channelers, practitioners of various magical and ritual traditions from across Europe and eventually from further afield, all drawn by the forest's reputation as a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin. They came in increasing numbers through the 1990s and into the 2000s, and they practiced in the clearing, and they left behind them, according to the researchers who continued to monitor the site's electromagnetic signature, a measurable change in the field intensity. Every large gathering of practitioners at the clearing produced a spike in the readings that was recorded by the monitoring equipment the Cluj-Napoca team had installed at the site perimeter. The spikes decayed over days and weeks, but never fully returned to the pre-gathering baseline. Each event left the field slightly stronger than it had been before. Timofte's feeding hypothesis, dismissed by some of his colleagues in the 1980s as an overreach, was looking increasingly difficult to argue with. The forest was being fed, not deliberately, not by anyone who understood what they were doing, but fed nonetheless, by the tourists and the researchers and the practitioners and the journalists and the filmmakers who arrived in growing numbers each year, each one bringing their fear and their wonder and their grief and their hope, and leaving traces of all of it behind in the electromagnetic signature of the clearing. The phenomenon was growing. The field was strengthening. And whatever was at the center of it, the ancient presence that Anake had perceived in 1995, and that the Dacian priests had oriented their most sacred ceremonies around 2,000 years ago, was becoming year by year and visitor by visitor, more present, more available, more capable of reaching across whatever boundaries separated it from the people who entered its domain. More capable, some of the researchers who continued to monitor the site quietly feared, of eventually reaching far enough that the boundary would stop being a boundary at all.
In 2007, a documentary filmmaker named Cristian Nicolescu traveled to Hoia Bachu with a crew of 4 people and 12 days of planned shooting. Nicolescu was not a believer. He had built his career on skeptical investigations of paranormal claims, producing documentaries that were known in the Romanian media landscape for their methodical and occasionally ruthless dismantling of supernatural narratives. He had debunked faith healers and exposed fraudulent mediums, and spent 3 weeks at a supposedly haunted monastery in Moldavia before concluding, on camera, that the only thing haunting it was poor ventilation and the power of suggestion. He came to Hoia Bachu with the same intention, not to find something, to demonstrate that there was nothing to find. His producer had suggested the project specifically because of the growing international profile of the forest and the commercial opportunity that a definitive, well-produced debunking represented. Niculescu agreed. He arrived at the tree line on a cold morning in early October with his crew, his equipment, and his well-practiced professional skepticism, and he spent the next 12 days having an experience that ended his career as a debunker, and that he has spent the years since attempting, with limited success, to find language adequate to describe. The first 4 days were unproductive in the way he had expected. The crew moved through the outer sections of the forest, filming the twisted trees, recording the compass anomalies, interviewing local people who repeated the standard testimonies about strange lights and uneasy feelings and animals that refused to enter the tree line. Niculescu was polite and attentive in his interviews, and privately found nothing in them that he could not account for through the standard mechanisms of rural legend building, the way isolated communities construct elaborate explanations for the things they do not understand, and pass those explanations down through generations until they acquire the weight of established fact. He was not dismissive of the people he spoke to. He understood that their experiences were real to them. He simply believed that the experiences themselves had ordinary explanations, and that his documentary would provide those explanations clearly and calmly and without condescension. On the 5th day, his sound recordist, a young woman named Ioana Flora, who had worked with Niculescu on 4 previous documentaries and who shared his skeptical orientation completely, reported that her equipment was picking up something that was not present in the ambient sound environment, not during filming, not during active recording sessions, during the playback of footage they had already shot. When Flora played back recordings made in the outer sections of the forest, in the portions of audio between the voices of the people they had filmed and the ambient sounds of wind and birdsong and their own footsteps, there were sounds that had not been there when the recordings were made. Not loud, not dramatic, but present on the audio in a way that was technically inexplicable. Because the recording equipment was functioning correctly, the audio files were not corrupted, and the sounds could not have been introduced during post-processing, because they appeared on the original raw files rather than on any edited version. Voices, not words, or not words in any language Flora or anyone else on the crew could identify, but the cadence and rhythm of speech, unmistakably. Conversation possibly, or something that resembled conversation in the way that a recording of conversation heard through several walls resembles conversation. The shape of it without the content, the form of human communication without the information it was supposed to carry. Niculescu listened to the recordings. He listened to them multiple times. He sent the files to a sound engineer in Bucharest who examined them and reported that they showed no signs of tampering or equipment malfunction, and that the sounds were in his professional assessment of uncertain origin. He did not include this information in the documentary he eventually made about Hoia Bachu, because the documentary he eventually made was not the documentary he had come to make, and the sounds on Flora's recordings were only the beginning of what changed it. On the 7th day, the crew entered the central clearing for the first time. Niculescu had been delaying this deliberately, building toward it in his planned narrative structure, saving the most famous and most frequently reported location for the midpoint of the shoot, when his crew was comfortable and his footage of the surrounding forest was complete. They entered the clearing in the early afternoon in clear weather with full batteries and functioning equipment, and the kind of professional calm that comes from experience and preparation. They began to film. And approximately 20 minutes after they entered the clearing, the camera operator, a man named Bogdan Sherban, who had been filming professionally for 15 years, and who was, by his own description, the least imaginative person he had ever met, lowered his camera and said quietly that he needed to leave. Not that he wanted to leave, not that he was uncomfortable or unwell. He said with a flatness in his voice that Flora, standing beside him, found more alarming than any amount of visible distress would have been, that he needed to leave immediately or something was going to happen that could not be undone. He could not explain what he meant. He did not try to explain it. He simply turned and walked to the clearing's edge and sat down in the grass outside it with his camera in his lap and did not speak again for the remainder of the afternoon. The remaining crew continued filming for another 30 minutes. In the footage from those 30 minutes, which Niculescu has shown to researchers who have studied the case and which has been analyzed in detail, several things are visible that were not visible to the crew when they were shooting. In the background of several shots, at the far edge of the clearing where the tree line begins, there are forms, not distinct,
not clearly human, but shaped in a way that is not consistent with the trees or the shadows of the trees or any other feature of the natural environment of the clearing. They are present in some frames and absent in others with no apparent pattern. They do not move in any footage where they are visible, but they appear in different positions from one frame to the next in a way that suggests movement occurring in the gaps between recorded frames. Niculescu, watching the raw footage for the first time in his editing suite in Bucharest 3 weeks after the shoot, stopped the playback when he first saw one of the forms, and sat in front of his screen for a long time before continuing. He has described this moment in interviews as the moment when he understood that the documentary he had planned to make was no longer possible. Not because the evidence he had gathered was insufficient to support a debunking, but because standing in front of that footage, looking at those forms at the edge of the clearing, he no longer wanted to debunk. He no longer believed that debunking was the honest response to what the evidence showed, and dishonesty was the one professional sin he had never been willing to commit. The documentary he made instead was released in 2009 and was titled in its English version, What the Clearing Holds. It was not a sensationalist film. It was quiet and methodical and deeply uncomfortable in the way that only honest films about things that resist honest explanations can be. It presented the audio anomalies and the visual anomalies in the footage without embellishment and without explanation. It presented the testimony of Bogdan Sherban, who agreed to be interviewed on camera about what he had felt in the clearing, speaking in the same flat, careful voice he had used when he walked out of it, describing a conviction so absolute and so sourceless that he still 2 years later had no framework for understanding it. That something in the clearing had been about to reach him in a way that would have been permanent. That leaving when he did had been the difference between returning to his life and not returning. He did not know what that meant. He knew that it was true. Niculescu himself appears on camera at the end of the film, sitting at the edge of the clearing in the same spot where Sherban had sat 2 years earlier. He speaks directly to the camera for approximately 4 minutes. He does not claim to know what Hoia Bachu is. He does not propose an explanation for what his crew experienced or what their equipment recorded. He says only that he came to the forest believing that the most honest thing a person could do in the face of the unknown was to insist on explanations, and that he is leaving it believing that the most honest thing a person can do in the face of certain kinds of unknown is to sit with them, to resist the comfort of premature explanation, to hold the not knowing as something valuable rather than as a problem to be solved. He says that the forest taught him this, not through any dramatic experience of his own. He did not lose time or hear voices or see things at the edge of his vision. He simply stood in the clearing and felt with a certainty that bypassed his intellect entirely and settled somewhere deeper, that the ground beneath him held more than he would ever be equipped to understand, and that the appropriate response to that feeling was not to explain it away, but to honor it, to let it be what it was, to leave the clearing without taking anything from it and without leaving anything behind, except perhaps a little of the arrogance that had brought him there in the first place. The film was not widely seen. It was too quiet for the audience that the subject matter might otherwise have attracted, too careful and too honest for the kind of entertainment that paranormal content had become by 2009. But among the researchers who had spent years studying Hoia Bachu, it was received as something rare, as a document that got the tone right, that matched the register of the place itself, that understood, as so few accounts of Hoia Bachu had managed to understand, that the forest was not a spectacle, that it was not there to frighten or to entertain or to confirm anyone's existing beliefs about the nature of reality, that it was simply itself, ancient and broken and aware and present, waiting in the way that things wait when they have been waiting long enough that waiting has become indistinguishable from being.
There is a question that every person who has seriously engaged with the evidence from Hoia Bachu eventually arrives at, and it is not the question you might expect. It is not what is in the forest. It is not whether the phenomena are real. Those questions have been answered, as thoroughly as the available evidence allows, by the decades of research we have moved through together in this account. The question that remains, the one that sits at the bottom of everything, once all the other questions have been examined and set aside, is this: what does the forest want? And I want to be precise about why I am framing it that way. Not what is the forest, not what causes the forest. What does it want? Because the accumulated testimony of everyone who has spent serious time in Hoia Bachu, from the Dacian priests who built their ceremonies around it, to the quantum physicists who mapped its electromagnetic signature, to the documentary filmmaker who sat at its edge and surrendered his skepticism to it, points toward a single consistent conclusion: that whatever is operating in that clearing is not random, is not indifferent, is oriented towards something, reaching towards something, with a persistence and a consistency across centuries that is itself a form of communication if you are willing to receive it. The Romanian villagers who kept their respectful distance from Hoia Baciu for generations understood this without needing to articulate it in the language of physics or psychology or paranormal research. They understood it the way you understand things that are simply part of the landscape of your life. Things you were born knowing because your parents knew them and their parents knew them, and the knowing has become so deep it no longer feels like knowledge but like instinct. The forest is not evil. This was their consistent position across every generation of testimony that ethnographers have been able to collect, and it is a position that stands in interesting contrast to the way the forest is typically framed in the international media coverage that has accumulated around it in the decades since Romania opened. The horror-inflected language, the haunted woods narrative, the framing of Hoia Baciu as a place of malevolent darkness is largely a Western import. The people who have always lived next to it do not describe it that way. They describe it as powerful, as old, as a place that demands respect and punishes carelessness and rewards the visitor who approaches it with the proper combination of humility and attention. They describe it, in other words, the way you describe a presence that has its own nature and its own requirements, and that will meet you differently depending on how you come to it. What the forest wants, in the framework that emerges from the totality of the evidence, is acknowledgement. This is not a mystical conclusion. It is a practical one, grounded in the pattern of what happens when people arrive at Hoia Baciu with different intentions and different orientations. The researchers who came to debunk left shaken and changed. The tourists who came to be frightened got what they came for and nothing more, leaving with good stories and no understanding. The practitioners who came to extract power or confirmation of their existing beliefs got that too, or something close enough to it that they could not distinguish the difference. But the people who arrived with genuine openness, without an agenda, without the need to have the forest confirm or deny anything, without the protective armor of predetermined interpretation, those people, a small and remarkably consistent group across a remarkably long span of time, report something different from everyone else. They report not terror and not entertainment, and not the validation of a belief system, but something quieter and harder to name, a feeling of having been met, of having stood in the presence of something ancient and aware, and deeply, inconsolably sad, and having that thing register them not as an intruder or a resource or a subject for study, but as a witness, as someone capable of understanding, even partially, what it had been holding for so long, and what it needed, in whatever way a non-human awareness can need anything, for that holding to finally begin to release. The grief in Hoia Baciu has a source. We have traced it as carefully as the evidence allows. The unburied dead of Ottoman campaigns, the shepherd and his vanished flock, the centuries of suffering pressed into soil that was never given ceremony, never acknowledged, never allowed the ritual of completion that every human tradition across every culture on earth has understood to be necessary for the dead to rest and for the living to continue. The forest is full of people who do not know they are dead, wandering in the dark between the trees, and the clearing at its center is the place where their accumulated presence has become so dense and so charged that it has altered the physical fabric of reality around it, bent the trees, burned the grass, disrupted the electromagnetic field, opened cracks in time wide enough for a 5-year-old girl to fall through and emerge 5 years later unchanged. All of this is the consequence of an enormous and unfinished grief that has had nowhere to go for centuries, because no one has ever stood at the center of it and said, with the full weight of human acknowledgement, "I know what happened here. I see what you are carrying. You do not have to carry it alone." I am not suggesting that the solution to Hoia Baciu is a ceremony. I am not suggesting that a ritual or a prayer or any specific act of acknowledgement would resolve what centuries of accumulated suffering have produced in that clearing. The physicists who have studied the electromagnetic anomalies would tell you that the field strength is now far beyond what any human gesture could simply dissolve, that whatever process has been building in that location for centuries has its own momentum and its own trajectory that will not be redirected by intention alone. They are probably right, but I am suggesting something smaller and perhaps more important than a solution. I am suggesting that the way we engage with Hoia Baciu matters, that the difference between arriving at that forest as a consumer of its strangeness and arriving as a genuine witness to its history is not merely a difference in attitude, it is a difference in what you contribute to what is already there, what you add to the field, what you leave behind when you go. Every person who has ever stood at the edge of that clearing and felt the grief press against them and turned away from it, retreating into irony or skepticism or the comfortable numbness of treating it as entertainment, has left something behind, a small addition to the weight of unacknowledged suffering that the ground has been holding since before they were born. And every person who has ever stood there and let the grief arrive fully, without flinching, without reaching for an explanation, without trying to contain it in a framework that makes it manageable, has left something different behind.
something that moves in the opposite direction from the accumulation, something small and probably insufficient, and yet not nothing at all.
The researchers will continue. The tourists will continue. The practitioners and the journalists and the filmmakers will continue to arrive at the tree line of Hoia Bachu with their instruments and their cameras and their various needs. And the forest will continue to be what it is, which is the most thoroughly documented anomalous location on the European continent, and simultaneously, the place that has most consistently defeated every attempt to fully know it. The clearing will remain barren. The trees will continue to grow in their impossible spirals. The electromagnetic field will continue to pulse at the frequency of the hypnagogic state, tuning certain nervous systems to a perception that the ordinary waking mind keeps carefully behind glass. The dead will continue to be present in the soil and the roots and the air of that 250 hectares of disturbed ground outside Cluj-Napoca. And the thing at the center of it all, the ancient awareness that Marius Inake perceived in 1995, and that the Dacian priests oriented their most sacred ceremonies around 2 millennia ago, will continue to be what it has always been, patient, present, looking back at everyone who looks at it with the same steady, ancient, inconsolable attention. I want to leave you with something that Florica Constantine said in an interview conducted in 1985, 17 years after her daughter walked out of Hoia Bachu unchanged. The interviewer asked her whether she had ever gone back to the forest after Andrea's return, whether she had ever stood again at the tree line where she had called her daughter's name every day for 5 years. Florica thought about this for a long moment before answering, and then she said that she went back once, a few months after Andrea came home, when Andrea was finally well enough that Florica felt she could leave her alone for an afternoon. She went to the tree line at the usual time, the time she had gone every day for 5 years. She stood at the edge of the forest. She did not call her daughter's name because her daughter was home. She simply stood there, and she said that the forest felt different to her that day than it ever had before, not less frightening, not safer, but different in a way she struggled to describe. She said it felt like the forest knew that she had kept coming back, that it had registered her 5 years of daily presence at its edge, her refusal to stop, her insistence on calling into the silence even when the silence never answered. She said it felt, standing there that afternoon, with her daughter finally home, like the forest was trying to tell her something, not in words, not in any way she could translate, but in the particular quality of the silence it offered her that day, which was different from every other silence she had heard from it across 5 years of standing at its edge. She said it felt like gratitude. I have been thinking about that word ever since I first encountered it in the archive of her testimony. Gratitude. From a forest. From a place that has taken people and bent trees and burned grass and disrupted the electromagnetic fabric of physical reality across centuries of accumulation. Gratitude. It is not the word you expect. It is not the word that fits the narrative of Hoia Bachu as it is usually told, as a place of darkness and danger and inexplicable terror. But it is the word that Florica Constantine used, a woman who had more direct experience of what the forest was capable of than almost any human being alive. And it is a word that I think deserves to be taken seriously, because if the forest is aware, as the evidence suggests it might be in some sense we do not yet have the vocabulary to describe precisely, and if what it holds is grief, as the testimony of everyone who has felt its emotional field consistently indicates, and if grief in its deepest form is the love that has nowhere left to go, then the response to being witnessed, to having someone stand at your edge and refuse to leave and refuse to stop calling, is exactly the one Florica Constantine described. Here at Liturgy of Whispers, we believe that the stories which matter most are the ones that resist easy endings, the ones that leave something open, that ask you to carry a question rather than offering you the comfort of an answer. Hoia Bachu is that kind of story. It will not be resolved in our lifetimes, or perhaps in any lifetime. The clearing will remain, the field will continue to pulse, the dead will remain in the soil, and the ancient awareness at the center of it will continue to look back at everyone who looks at it, patient and present, waiting for the witness that centuries of human carelessness and human fear have so far failed to provide. If you have stayed with this story until the end, I want to ask you something, not where you were watching from, though I asked you that at the beginning and I hope you told me. I want to ask you what you are carrying that has not been acknowledged, what grief you have been holding in the dark between your own trees, pressing against the boundaries of your ordinary life, waiting for someone to stand at the edge of it and refuse to leave, because Hoia Bachu is not only a forest in Romania, it is a description of what happens when suffering goes unwitnessed long enough, when the dead are not honored,
and the grief is not named, and the ground is never given the ceremony it needs to release what it holds. It is a description, in the language of twisted trees and barren clearings, and electromagnetic fields and lost time, of what we all become when no one comes to the edge of us and calls our name. The forest is still there, the clearing is still barren, the field is still pulsing, and somewhere in the deep heart of those 250 hectares of disturbed and ancient ground, something is still waiting, still reaching, still hoping, in whatever way hope is available to something that old and that patient, and that thoroughly acquainted with the failure of the living to see what is right in front of them, that the next person who steps across the tree line will be the one who finally understands what it has been trying, across all these centuries of silence and strangeness and desperate beautiful reaching, to say. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what you felt as you listened. Tell me what stayed with you. And if you are watching this in the dark, alone, in the quiet hours when the world is asleep, and the distance between what is visible and what is not becomes, for just a moment, negotiable, pay attention to the silence around you. Listen to it carefully, because sometimes the silence has something to say, and sometimes, if you are very still and very honest and very willing to hear it, it sounds exactly like a forest breathing. This has been Liturgy of Whispers. I will see you in the next story.